Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Meltzer. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institution specializing in global trade and development. His work focuses on issues related to international trade as well as U.S. trade with key economies such as China, India, Japan, and the European Union. He currently serves as an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., as well as an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law School in Washington, D.C. Thank you and welcome.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Velasquez, honourable members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity today to share my views with you on US trade strategy and what's next for small business exporters. In 2011, it became clear that concluding the WTO Doha round in its current form is not possible. Efforts are therefore underway to make progress on elements of the Doha agenda, and the United States is taking the lead in such areas as services liberalisation. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP negotiations, are really the only other trade negotiation to which the United States is currently a party. The 9 countries involved in these negotiations, including the United States, are Australia, Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore and Vietnam. The TPP also has the potential to be the building block for a wider free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific region, a goal endorsed by APEC leaders and recently reiterated by United States Trade Representative Ron Kirk at the TPP negotiations in Dallas this week. Given the focus of the current administration on completing the TPP negotiations this year, I will focus the rest of my testimony on the implications of the TPP for the United States and small businesses. In particular, I will focus on the economic implications of the TPP, the role of the TPP in achieving free trade in the Asia-Pacific region, and finally we'll discuss some of the implications for small businesses. The Asia-Pacific region is crucial for the United States. It is the fastest growing region in the world and a key driver of economic growth. Indeed, the region already accounts for 60% of global GDP and 50% of international trade and is expected to grow by around 8% this year. In 2011, United States exports to TPP economies were worth approximately $105 billion and imports were valued at $91 billion, giving the United States a trade surplus in the range of $14 billion. However, the economic benefits to the United States of the TPP will be greatly expanded as more countries join. And in this regard, already Canada, Mexico and Japan have expressed interest in joining. And should these countries join, then the agreement will end up covering over $800 billion worth of exports and $875 billion worth of imports of goods and services. The potential economic gains to the United States from the TPP highlights its significance as a template for free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. The recent Korea-United States Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect on March 15th this year, will likely serve as a baseline in the negotiations. USTR is also seeking agreement on a range of new rules, such as on regulatory coherence, to reduce trade barriers arising from unnecessary regulatory diversity amongst TPP countries, and rules on state-owned enterprises that will discipline the trade-distorting impact that they have when they are not operating according to competitive market-based principles. The TPP should also address the realities for businesses which rely on supply chains located in different countries, often in the Asia-Pacific region. Developing coherent rules of origin is one way of ensuring that the TPP reflects these business realities. Progress on trade facilitation, which reduces the cost of moving goods through customs, is another one. The TPP can also provide an important framework to develop new rules that protect the free flow of data across borders. The internet is now a key driver of trade, and actually especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, as these companies are now able to use the internet to access customers overseas and at scale. The TPP will also address the trend in the Asia-Pacific region towards regional economic integration that excludes the United States. For instance, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has free trade agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. These agreements divert trade from the United States, and in the absence of US participation in developing these trade rules, undermines the United States' leadership in the region. In this light, the TPP will also be an important vehicle for pursuing economic integration that is both Asia-Pacific in scope and involves the United States. Small and medium-sized businesses will stand to gain significantly from trade liberalisation under the TPP. In fact, almost 98% of all exporters and 97% of importers are small and medium-sized enterprises, though representing only 40% of goods and 31.5% of imports, so there's clearly room for growth. In addition to this, 94% of small and medium-sized enterprises both import and export. Therefore, trade agreements such as the TPP, which both liberalise barriers in the United States and abroad, should benefit small businesses. Small businesses will also benefit the most from government efforts to reduce trade barriers, as their capacity to overcome these barriers, for instance, by establishing subsidiaries overseas, is certainly limited. The TPP has a potential to be a 21st century trade agreement, and if it fulfills these ambitions, small businesses should stand to gain. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today.